Hi, and welcome to this week's lecture on intra-abdominal pressure, or IAP. We're going to discuss what it is, its execution, why we would use it, its application, some assistive devices, and when to avoid using it. So, intra-abdominal pressure is the pressure created within the abdominal cavity for the purpose of stabilizing your spine, rib cage, and pelvis. It involves the diaphragm as well as the pelvic floor, lower back, and abdominal muscles. So how do you execute intra-abdominal pressure? How do you increase your intra-abdominal pressure? Well, what you do is you inhale a moderate amount of air, so nothing crazy. And then as you inhale, you need to push your midsection outwards in all directions. And what that does is it pushes the diaphragm downwards, contracting it, and it creates an increase in the pressure in this area. So in and around your core, right? So what that can do is it can make that area quite rigid and stable. So we're not able to bend as much. So here's a video of me performing some intra-abdominal breathing and then building my intra-abdominal pressure. So I'm taking a breath, expanding pushing my diaphragm down, expanding my midsection, and you'll see that when I change position, you can do it as well. So I take a big breath, push my midsection outwards, increase the pressure in that area, and then exhale and come back to normal. So intra-abdominal pressure limits how much your spine can bend. So for example, if you try to take a big breath and expand your midsection and push that area out and hold your breath and try and reach your toes, you're going to struggle. You're not going to be able to bend over as much. But if you release all the air out of your lungs and then try and reach your toes, it's going to be much, much easier. And that's because we're essentially just filling a balloon in our midsection, and then we're preventing how much we can move that balloon around. Makes sense, right? So this will allow for greater degrees of tension to be placed on the specific and intended muscle groups. So the reason why we're limiting how much movement occurs in our spine is so that when we do a deadlift or we do a squat, we have more movement of the hip and the glutes, the knee and the quads, and the hamstrings, okay? The goal is to limit how much the spine moves so our other joints can move and thus more pressure can be placed on these other muscle groups. So here's a video example of what I'm talking about. So you've got this guy on the left. He is going to do a deadlift. He's not going to use intra-abdominal pressure. And what you'll see is that his back is doing a lot of the work in this exercise. So his legs aren't really moving that much. His legs go up, they stop at a fixed position, and then his back finishes the movement. Doing so isn't inherently bad, like it won't cause you pain. However, it will result in less muscle growth in the specific areas that we're trying to focus on. We're trying to load the glutes, the hamstrings, and the quads evenly so that they're the areas that get tired the fastest. If we're finishing workouts and our lower back's wrecked and we haven't even got that much of a pump in our legs, then that wasn't really the goal. The goal of the LGN program is to look good naked. So we need to train these muscle groups like our glutes, so our bum, our quads, so our thigh muscles, and our hamstrings, and our calves. We want to train our legs really well so that they function well, but they also look great. So we need to place as much load on them as possible. So doing this and deadlifting in this manner is not going to get us there. It'll tire us out, sure. But as far as actually developing those muscle tissues, you're not going to see much development. And if you take one look at this guy, his legs kind of explain what I'm talking about. So this is one of my clients. Her name's Tori. FYI, she's also done powerlifting and CrossFit. She uses intra-abdominal pressure. She's able to stabilize her midsection. So she limits movement there, and the movement comes about in this exercise at the hips and at her knee. Yeah, she's pretty jacked. So why else would we use intra-abdominal pressure? Well, it's because it enhances proprioception. So this is our ability to feel where our body is in space and time without necessarily looking at our body. What does that mean, Brent? Well, it means that if I close my eyes and I try and do a shoulder press, sometimes it's going to move kind of weird or adjunct. It's not moving in the right way, or it's not moving symmetrically, right? And this could mean that I have a very poor sense of proprioception, especially if I don't feel this difference. If I'm doing this, my proprioception might be lower, right? So when we release all the air out of our lungs and we compress and collapse our midsection, our back will curve more and we won't be able to feel how much our back is curving. So we're potentially putting more load on the spine again. So by using intra-abdominal pressure and taking a breath and expanding our midsection and pushing our diaphragm down and getting that to all work, it limits how much our glutes can tuck under and it allows us to feel when this is happening. So this is some footage of my partner Christine doing it. She takes a breath, expands, goes down, and she can feel the point at which her bum wants to tuck under. And so it's easier for her to stop and then come back up. Just for the record, there's nothing inherently bad about butt wink either. It's not going to necessarily cause pain in people. But again, for the purposes of looking great naked and training the muscle tissues that we're trying to train, it just transmits the load onto other areas. And my goal is to limit how much our back has to work so then that way we can train our back in other training sessions throughout the week. I don't want your back to be absolutely wrecked after a squat workout, because that means if you train back the day after legs, you might not be able to perform that well because your back's just wrecked. It needs more time to recover. And so if you train in this fashion, you're going to limit how much you can train per week because you're just going to be exhausted. You're going to be recovering from these hardcore squat and deadlift sessions. So if you use this technique and you limit how much non-specific stress is placed on the back, then you'll be able to train the back when you need to and train the legs when you need to as well. Your back will still get worked in these exercises, don't get me wrong. We're just trying to limit how much stress it takes by evenly distributing the tension across all muscle groups. So we should use intra-abdominal pressure during compound lifts, so like squats, deadlifts, bent over rows, overhead press, because these are the exercises where our spine isn't stabilized by an external object. So when we do incline dumbbell press on a bench, for example, we don't have to worry about using intra-abdominal pressure because our back is supported by the bench. There's no pressure being placed through the spine. So we don't have to worry about stabilizing our lower body. But in these sorts of exercises, it can become very, very useful. You can also use it out of the gym. If you have to lift an awkward sized object and carry it in a weird fashion, then you're going to want to know about this breathing technique and use it. How to use intra-abdominal pressure? Well, you can either maintain the pressure per rep. So let's say you're squatting. As you take a breath at the start of the rep, you hold it all the way down and all the way back up, and then you reset at the top once you've completed the rep. So you can either do that, but for people who are short of breath quickly, or they're maybe not that fit, or this makes them lightheaded, for example, because they have some sort of breathing issue, or they just don't like it, what you can do instead is just take a breath at the apex of the movement. So the hardest part of the movement, that's where I want you guys to take a breath and expand your diaphragm. So in a squat, as you're lowering down, that's when you're taking the breath in. And when you get to the bottom of the rep, the hardest part, that's where you really expand your diaphragm. And then as you're coming up, you can breathe out. So that's another way of efficiently using intra-abdominal pressure, but it's up to you and how you feel comfortable doing it and your learning proficiency of the movement. If you feel like it's easier to just hold the breath for the entire rep and then come back up, then you can do that. If you've mastered that pretty well, you just want to hold your breath just down the bottom part and the hardest part of the movement, then that's cool too. What I don't want is people holding their breath for the entirety of a set. I'm saying reps, not sets. Please don't try and hold your breath for 10 reps. Psychotic, you might pass out. Don't do that. So now that you understand how intra-abdominal pressure works, you might understand why we use weightlifting belts in weight training. Because if we're forcefully pushing our abdominal section out, our core outwards, right? And the belt, a weightlifting belt, is pulling it back in. That's just further increasing the intra-abdominal pressure in that space because you're applying a resisting force to the force that you're creating outwards. So it's just creating more and more pressure. So this is why strong men, power lifters, and anyone going for a 1RM attempt can use weightlifting belts. It just helps to enhance stability and pressure in that area. Do you need to use it for the LGN program? Up to you. We're usually doing sets of 6, 8, 10, 12 reps. So it may not necessarily be warranted, but I've got nothing against it. If you guys want to use it, go ahead. That's absolutely fine. So when would we want to avoid using intra-abdominal pressure? Well, during compound exercises where your spine is supported, there's no need for it. So if you're doing a chest supported row, for example, or an inclined dumbbell press, or anything where you have to lay on a bench, you don't have to use it because your spine is supported. There's no need. During isolation exercises, so leg extension, laying hamstring curl, bicep curls, anything where the weight's really light and you're isolating just a specific and very small muscle group, again, I wouldn't worry about it. During activities where spinal fluidity and flexibility are required, so yoga, definitely not needed. You don't want something that's going to restrict your range of motion, impeding your yoga or your performance. And that leads us on to the next point. During sports, during sports, you're going to need to breathe at really, really high rates. You don't want to be holding your breath and pass out. It's not a good idea. Now, other circumstances as well include when you're pregnant. Don't do this. It increases the amount of pressure in that area. We don't want to put the child's health at risk during that time period. If you have any issues controlling bowel movements, please let Ben know. But intra-abdominal pressure is definitely a contraindication in this circumstance. We don't want to increase pressure in someone who has incontinence and is unable to control their bowel movements, because this will lead to flatulence, it'll lead to urination, and it may lead to actual defecation as well. So actually going to the bathroom. So if you struggle with anything like that, please let Ben know. We can make modifications to your program to avoid that. But yes, for you guys, intra-abdominal pressure is not a good idea. And if you have high blood pressure, we don't want to further spike our blood pressure. Please talk to your doctor about this if even weight training is even appropriate for you, but also make sure to let Ben or myself know, because we can make adjustments with your training to allow you plenty of rest time in between your sets, so then that way your blood pressure isn't further stimulated too high to a point where it's unmanageable. Cool. Hope you guys enjoyed this lecture, and I'll see you next time for another one. Bye.